Hello, I'm Dr. Niecikowski. Thank you for joining me in this debut video on how to use the Comprehensibility of Rulebook's performance list to evaluate Marvel United. Now it's said in the title here, number 9. Well, that's because I evaluated 8 rulebooks as part of my dissertation. You'll see the links below this video on how to acquire the performance list and the other PDFs that support the performance list. And so I backed Marvel United on Kickstarter and received my copy 2 Saturdays ago, and right away read it and played it. And when I presented my research at Gen Con Online, I remember mentioning it during one of the sessions that I said that this rulebook I predicted would be a well-written rulebook. You're about to find out very quickly here its comprehensibility score, and then I'm going to go into a lot of detail. So the first part, for those of you who don't want to go into a lot of detail, you're going to find out very quickly if this is the comprehensibility score. For those of you who are rulebook writers and editors or game designers, I'm going to go into the weeds, and for the first time you're going to see all 92 weighted features and how this rulebook is weighted. So let's get started. First, let's take a look at a little disclaimer here. This is criticism, comment, scholarship, and research. And so I am using screenshots of different parts of the rulebook to continue my research. So to begin with, below, as I mentioned, you'll find out how to get the performance list of features and the research supplement, which, if you look back here, incorporates coding 50 different Board Game Geek threads from 541 different BGG users on what they like and dislike about rulebooks, and incorporating recommendations from 5 books on document design. The performance list I'm about to show you was developed by 21 experts in the industry and backed up then by the research here. And then, if you're interested, you have the dissertation, which is going to go into areas for further research. And I want to start out with that the findings from my research are just that. Preliminary findings based on what I found on BGG and from those 21 experts. Hundreds of more rulebooks will need to be evaluated to determine whether or not the performance list will hold up over different evaluations. So this is, like I said, number 9 out of potentially hundreds of more that will have to be done. In addition, how will other evaluators rate? So for instance, I have a score that I came up with on this where 2, 3, 4 other people have a similar score or will deviate by a large amount. See, that remains to be seen through further research. So one thing to keep in mind, that as the famous guitarist Nigel Tufnell of Spinal Tap, that's nitpicking, isn't it? Yes, in some ways it is, but again, we're talking about making a rulebook that is the most comprehensible as possible. And why did I include the Marvel United Fact 1.0 there in the right-hand corner? Well, that's because after I did my evaluation and later this week, about 4 days ago, the Kickstarter put out this FAQ. So you're going to find out that some of my findings are supported by the fact that they had to answer many questions after the Kickstarter that people who've been playing the game wanted to have some clarification on. So, in other words, the performance list, the evaluation of this rulebook, and the issues with it, there's not many. It's actually a very well-written rulebook. The fact had to be addressed in the FAQ. So you'll find out here in a moment for those of you who have the game. All right, so here's the comprehensibility score. Again, there's 10 categories, 92 features. The percentage is 85%, which according to my findings based on the original 8 rulebooks, again, this is just number 9. I need to do more rulebooks to see if this will hold up. If you look on the next slide, that means it's pleasurable. Learning the game from the rules is successful and without frustration. Referencing is adequately supported. And comprehensibility is confident where outside resources may be sought for confirmation. Now, for me, I did look up some outside resources. You're going to find that I made some miscues. I'm going to talk about that later. It has nothing to do with the rulebook is not well written. It had to do with the reference supports that if you're going to see my recommendations, that would have helped me avoid some errors. In addition, as I mentioned, the FAQ would also, if some things would have done differently, the FAQ might not have had to have been 3 pages long. And so it's not in the rulebook is not in the annoying range or the frustrating range. So you may notice behind me, why do I have these two games here? Well, as I mentioned on Gen Con Online, I said that I predicted this would be a well-written rulebook, just based on when I was back in the Kickstarter, and the performance list bears that out. I just got Red Outpost, started learning this game. If I evaluate this rulebook, I predict it will probably be in the annoying range. And then the same thing here, when I tried to start looking at Robotech here, this is likely in the lower end of annoying and possibly in the frustrating range. In fact, I looked it up. I guess they came out with a new version of this rulebook because the original one is not too well done. So the only reason I'm pointing this out is that when I'm a gamer just like you. I get new games, and I will be able to get through this one, and we're going to be playing it soon, but there's some issues with it big time. In fact, there's some errata in it, some oversights, I should say. And then this one, I don't know if I'm going to get to this one because it's that annoying already. But I was pleased with this rulebook when I saw it on the Kickstarter. It's one of the reasons why I backed it. So those other 2 rulebooks, we'll see down the road if I evaluate them. And you're going to be able to help me do that. I'm going to have a survey on the Kickstarter and on my webpage down the road for those of you who would like to suggest things for me to evaluate. All right, so let's start out with the first category, overview category. And it met all these features. So if I show you here on this camera, when I go through a rulebook for the first time, I'll make notes. And notice this is like a first read here. This is like what's called a think aloud and reading research. And this is something that can be done with when you do play testing. You have your people who read your rule book, have them make comments. And again, I'm removing them here. I just wanted to show you how many comments I made as I was reading it. And then I went back through it as I went through the performance list as what questions I had. And again, this is be something I would do if someone wanted me to evaluate the rulebook. I would go do the same thing. And you can see all the comments I made here. And again, the overview, as I will show you in the very beginning here, is well done. And again, I just don't want to have all my comments here because it's basically reflected in my score on the performance list. And then here is the rule summary on the back. Okay, so those are all the comments I made, which helped me come up with the score. So overview is here, and then it does a good job here of going over the pieces. Notice that it shows the back side of the cards and the other side. And then here is a setup here and here. So if you go to the overview category here, it met all of those features. Now, why is something in red there? Because overview 1.1 might be something in a rule book that doesn't have any story. Now, this game definitely has story. There is a little bit of flavor text, but it's definitely not distracting. Now, a game like chess probably would not have any story, so that's why you wouldn't evaluate that. Now, if anything there is a 0, that means it's not a weighted feature. It means it's optional. So atmosphere fiction is minimal, or story is good, which is that's a subjective thing. That's a weight of 0. So you can see that it got 16 out of 16 in the score there. 15 plus 1 is 16. And so if you go back here to the score, you see in the green there, everything's color-coded, 16 out of 16. Now let's go to the next category. Now you may want to pause this as I go along if you want to read this in more detail. Again, you will be able to get the PDF down the road. In fact, if you haven't seen the Kickstarter yet, the PDF will be have a Creative Commons license. It will be available for everybody. It's whether or not you want to help me out and back the reference supplement and the dissertation, which goes into a lot more detail. And like I said, it's like a professional development to help you, if you're a rulebook writer, editor, or game designer, to improve your rulebook writing or editing. Okay, next category, the components category. And you can see that I boxed here in red that it had difficult with component management is described in detail throughout. So basically it got a 10 out of 11. It missed 1 point in 2.1. So what does that look like? Well, it's right here. So on page 8 and page 11, and again, this is especially the crisis tokens, is reflected in the FAQ. There's a lot of questions on how to use that. And so what it really needed to do, the rulebook, to improve comprehensibility is, I shall show you right here on page 11. This is all that it talked about on crisis tokens, but there are villains that have you place crisis tokens all the time. In fact, when I was reading this, I had no idea really when you get a crisis token. So it would have helped to have had an example in that area as well, which I'll get to in a moment. So that's one area that it needed to go into more detail. And again, it's reflected in the FAQ. So the next category is the content category. Now, you'll see there's some areas that are grayed out here because now I'm going to show you the next page here. This is content 3.1 to 3.7. The next page will show 3.8 to 3.14. And so I'm going to go into detail on 3.1, 3.5, and 3.7 as to why the rulebook did not meet those features. And then here's the other half here, and what's grayed out, because again it's in red. This is not necessarily a game that requires those features, which again I'll show you here in a moment. Okay, so let's talk about 3.1. So rules are clear with no contradictions throughout. So right away I noticed this with the language. I was thinking, why is it saying up to 4 cards? Either you draw 4 cards or you don't. Okay, because when you're KO'd, you lose all your cards. I mean, actually, to be KO'd, you won't have any cards. That's how you get KO'd in this game. So why would you draw up to? Because if you're basically out of cards. So the rule summary verified what I was thinking as I was reading it. It doesn't make sense. But if you look at the rule summary here, it says draw 4 cards. So there is a contradiction there in the rules. And it's mentioned in 2 places, on page 7 and 10, but it's clarified on the rules summary. The next issue is content 3.5. All key concepts are explained in context. So if you look there at page 7, this is a miscue I made when I was playing the game, which I'll explain later. But it would have been nice if the turn sequence was not on page 9 and it would have been explained there on page 7 or before that. Now, that's a very important thing for a rulebook to do, is to help establish context by explaining the turn sequence right away after you learn the component, after you set up the game. It's kind of in a weird area. In addition, on page 5, it talks about heroes winning, and it says if they defeat the villain, to be able, you win if you defeat the villain, but then it says to be able to damage the villain, but it doesn't say, is that how you defeat the villain? You got to damage the villain? So I needed to include something there. Again, some of you might be thinking, well, that's nitpicking. Well, yeah, it is. You got to understand that even though this book has an 85% score, for someone like me who's an experienced rulebook reader will have no problem figuring it out, this game is being sold in Walmart and Target for people who are not as experienced in the hobby will buy it. And they're going to have difficulty in some of these areas here. And again, the FAQ reflects that. So again, it needed to say something like, you defeat the villain by damaging it, at least in this version. Now, when we get the other expansions, we might defeat the villain in other ways. We don't know. But at least in the core set, it needed to say that. In addition, with action tokens, I was wondering the whole time, well, how do you get those action tokens? Well, when you play the game, you find out that some characters play cards and they can give action tokens to other heroes. But it doesn't have that example. So again, the context is not provided for that rule. Okay, the next area was logical ordering of rules. I already explained the turn sequence should have been in a different area. And then, in fact, if you notice here on the back, that would have been nice to have seen this. You get 1 villain turn, then 3 clockwise hero turns, and then continue until the first mission is completed. It really doesn't say that succinctly or provide the example as you see on page 9. It needed to say that on page 5. So again, you had to read further to get that, which for someone who's not an experienced rulebook reader might have difficulty. And then here's the grayed out portions. You don't need a tutorial playbook because the game is not that complicated. And on content 3.12, there is no scoring. You either defeat the villain or you don't, and therefore you don't need any tie-breaking conditions. So therefore you remove that from the total. There actually is 182 possible points. But if you go back here, the score reflects the fact that some features you don't evaluate. As I show you here, there is 171 possible points. So 11 points of features were removed from the maximum. And it scored 145 out of 171 of those possible points. So let me go to where we left off here. All right, so moving on. Okay, so examples. This is a very important category, and it does pretty well, except, like I said, examples 4.1. You're going to find out here in a moment, examples 4.5. Now, the examples that do provide are clear and concise, and it does not include new rules. Now, that's very important. Too many rule books do that. They include rules in the examples, which I noticed in the Robotech book. Again, I'm not looking forward to reading that book if I get, well, I don't want to get into that. But I noticed right away when I was skimming it, it had examples, rules in the examples. So why do I have that star there? Because I'm not going to go into detail on a different slide here. A round of playthrough is provided. Now, this would have been really useful, especially to avoid the FAQ. If they would have gone through the player turn sequence and how you get crisis tokens, especially if you're playing with the red skull for the first time, it would have really helped maybe some people who are not used to playing this game. In fact, my prediction, I described in my dissertation, that although this rule book is pleasurable for the intended audience, it might be annoying for those who are not experienced gamers. So it drops down a category for those for people who are not experienced. So let's go over 4.1 and 4.5. All right, so all core game mechanics are explained through examples. And so I didn't explain that really in when you rescue civilians. It would have been nice to explain that with an example, well, especially the part where it talks about, I think there is an example about that. It's really the issue of explaining overflow and the crisis tokens, which again is explained in the FAQ. So really, rescue civilians is in, they do provide an example of that through the description, but not the overflow part. It would have been nice to see that. Oh, especially, now going back to that, especially since the fact that you can win and lose depending on what villain you play with the overflow. If you add too many thugs and civilians, it overflows, you add crisis tokens, and then you can lose the game. If you can't, like with Ultron, if you fill them all up, you're done. Okay, so the next one here on examples 4.5, it's the same thing. Visual examples are provided for every major rule, so it's not enough just to provide a text example. It should have included a visual sample, especially when you're placing thugs and civilians and when it's overflowing on different locations. All right, so the next area is language. So it did pretty well on most areas, except 5.4 to 5.7. And so it may not be possible to meet all these conditions, which I explained in my dissertation. But for those four, let's go over those. So all paragraphs describing rules are on one topic. So again, this is a difficult area here in the rule book. And again, it makes me wonder, did they get to the point where it's like, this happens. I mean, I was a publisher. At some point, you got to get the game out, okay? And now some publishers think this, well, we don't want that many pages. We don't want to intimidate people with that many pages. I argue it's okay to have 2 more pages if it's going to include more examples. So that way people have a successful experience and give you positive reviews. So I'm not too sure, did they give people the rule book here and play test it? Because again, it's the same area here that tends to be having problems, which is right here on this page, which is towards the end of the rule book. Okay, and then again it ends. So I don't know why they kind of rushed this area here, especially since the missions is the most important part of the game. That's what you need to do to win. So back to here. So there is embedded in here Notice the title says Rescue Civilians. That's great. Most of it's about that. But then it starts including, like I said, the overflow effect, which should have been a different section. It should have been separated out with a different heading. And again, the rulebook has an excellent hierarchy here. It goes from the yellow to the red and then to this, so it has 3 levels of hierarchy. It needed to include at least something in red here that says overflow, a different section. All right, so moving back to the next thing here. So 5.5 and 5.6, each expository sentence explains one topic or one rule, and all expository sentences are short. So it gets dinged here for on page 7, that's a pretty big sentence, and it includes more than one topic or rule. It would have been better to split that up. Again, some of you might be saying, that's nitpicking. Yes, it is. It still got a high score, but it could have earned an even higher score if it wasn't for a sentence like this. Again, all it required just a little bit of editing and splitting it up. All right, and 5.7. Again, this is difficult to do. So action verbs, again, this is what's recommended in the document design books here, that you begin sentences with actions. Pandemic was the highest rated rule book of the first 8 for my dissertation. And when you look at Pandemic, it does this successfully. I think it was the only rule book that had action verbs that began every section that needed a player action, and then also in the headings. So this rule book tends to do that, but not consistently. So again, if you look right here, it says place, take, but then it goes into each player and each player. You could have offset that by saying each player and then done bullet points, chooses a hero, places, and then places, and then shuffles. So it could have been done, organized in a different way. So that way when you're scanning, and again, a lot of these recommendations are based on when I have to look up a rule later, can I find it quickly? And when you start with action verbs, that helps you find it. Because then I'm looking for that keyword shuffle or that keyword choose. So again, this was reflected in the literature, and it was, again, supported by the 21 experts, industry experts. And again, here you see in during the list of what players do, their steps, location effects there. It should say resolve location effects. Again, that tells me that a decision has to be made. Or choose to resolve location effects would have been the better response, because you do not have to do it. So if you were to say, for instance, choose to resolve location effects or something to that effect, then you would know just by looking at the steps that I don't even have to do that if I don't want to. Okay, so terms, I did very well in this area, and there's not even another slide on this. There was no acronyms or abbreviations that I saw that needed to be spelled out when first used, so therefore that was removed from the evaluation because it didn't have any. Now if it did, it could have either met it or didn't meet it, whether or not it spelled it out when it was first used. So anyways, there was no acronyms or abbreviations that I noticed. Okay, the next one is reference. Now this is a really important category here. This is where additional research will have to be done in this because referencing is important when you're reading the rule book before you play the game. And then while you're playing the game, can you find something? Because unless you got a super memory, and I don't. Okay, I think I have an average to above average, but I don't have photographic memory. Okay, I need to be able to look at the rule book when we're playing the game, especially when you're teaching it the first time and playing it the first time. And then see, that's working memory and short-term memory. And then when I play, because we haven't played this in a week, when we go back to it, well, I have been able to find stuff and reactivate my long-term memory. Or if this sits on the shelf for a year, well, I'll be able to find it quickly. So referencing is so important. So you'll see the areas there in red. I'll go over it right now. There was no player aid card that could have included, for instance, those steps. And so, again, it's a minor thing. It's 1 point that I didn't receive. And notice there's a little symbol there. The performance list is designed to evaluate PDFs without having to own the copy of the game. But if you didn't own the copy of the game, you might not be able to determine whether or not there is a player aid. So that's why that's one of the performance list features that you might not be able to evaluate if you're just evaluating electronic copy. Now, since I own the game, I was able to determine that. So that one didn't have a player aid. And then the parts there in gray I'll explain in a little bit. And here's the second part of the reference list. Now, the index, now there is could be some debate on whether or not what's considered a long rule book. 8 pages is typical. Okay, this is 12 pages. So I'm saying that it needed to include an index and a glossary, which it didn't. An FAQ, which I'll explain in a minute what that means. But I did a good job of cross-referencing. That did link to the electronic version. That's how I was able to get these screenshots here by using the PDF that was available online. And then again, it did provide an FAQ online. I'll tell you the difference in a minute here. All right, so let's look at the first one. Terms of referencing. So actually, you know what? I think I was supposed to go over all of these here with that note. Yeah, so I'm trying to activate my memory here. Again, I record this live. I do not edit this. So the part in gray is at least one rulebook includes all rules as a comprehensive reference. So it's basically when you have multiple rulebooks. This does not have multiple rulebooks like some Fantasy Flight games, so you don't evaluate it. So it's removed from the total. Quick start rules are not needed because it's not complicated enough or long enough. So this is a judgment on my part. Even though it's 12 pages to determine that it needs a glossary and index, it wasn't long enough to have a quick start rules or complicated enough. And then the reference supplement with detailed rule descriptions is provided. Again, it's not long enough to need that or complicated enough. Again, so it sounds like I am contradicting myself. And again, this will have to come out through further rule books. Again, this performance list is a baseline. After more and more rule books, and with your help and feedback, I may need to include more detail there to say the keyword complicated, and as well as longer. And so it could say longer and or complicated. So it is long enough in my opinion. And again, this is where you'd have other evaluators need to look at the same rule book to whether or not they agree with me. I think it is long enough to have an index and a glossary, especially when it's using certain terms that are unique to this game system. And when they add in the other rule books for the expansions, it'd probably be very useful to have that because we might have to be looking at multiple rule books. And then the FAQ, now why is that there? It should have an FAQ to answer questions, not to address errors though. So what does that mean? Some games ship with an FAQ that's slipped into the box after the rulebook has been published. So they notice an error and they tell the printer, or when they put it together themselves, they have to put in something in there to address an error in the rulebook after it was printed. And so when you open up the box, you get the rulebook and you see this little sheet and it will say note, see page, blah, blah, blah. This needs to, or they'll have a sticker you have to put on the board or something like that to correct an error. So that's what that feature is about. It's that you have an FAQ to help answer potential questions, but not an FAQ to address errors. And some rule books ship with that, and this one did not include an FAQ. Okay, so why is referencing important? Now let me explain what's going on here. Part of my research again is that referencing is very, very important. So other research that can be done is you read the rule book and you can observe people playing it. You give it to somebody in the group to read it, you watch them teach it, and you watch them how they play and what miscues, which is a euphemism for errors, but a miscue is defined as an unexpected response. The reason why we use that vocabulary is because for younger children, you want to say you made an error or a mistake. It's much more positive to say you made a miscue and an unexpected response, okay? Because when you're reading, you're making predictions all the time, and based on your background and your culture, you're going to make predictions based on that and anticipating what you're and how experienced you are with a particular text. So even though I'm a very experienced gamer, I have over 2,500 games in my library, I'm a game designer, I've been in the industry since 1999. Let me tell you about the miscues I made. And you got to keep in mind that what's going on right now in my life is that I'm working 12-hour days because of all the online teaching I'm having to do. And so I can be tired when I read these rule books. And so I depend on the rule summary, which is on the back of the rule book right here. So even though I read the rule book and I say, okay, I got it, I look at the rule summary for reference. But what's missing from the rule summary? Well, one, the setup. For whatever reason, I thought you still play with 7 out of 8 locations and not 6. That's just me, whatever, I made a miscue. But it's not on the rule summary, which I was depending on. A very important rule that I didn't remember, I knew that heroes use the previous icons of the previous card. What I thought is that when a villain card is played, you reset that. So in other words, I thought that when Captain Marvel played that card, she does not have access to Iron Man's move action. So we made it super hard on herself, not using the actions of the previous card, even though there was a villain card in between. So for those of you who haven't played the game yet, you put down a hero card, you put down another, the first hero goes, the second hero, then the third hero, villain card comes down. Then the next hero goes in clockwise order. We were ignoring, like I said, the icon, the bottom row there of the previous hero, even though they were separated by a villain card. So I made that mistake because it wasn't on the rules summary, because that's what I was depending on. So it's really important for someone like me and other gamers, and again, it's reflected on the performance list, to provide a complete reference. So let's take a look at what that is in the dissertation. It reorganized the performance list into 3 categories. Again, this would have to be more research on this and how to do this effectively. 31 of the 92 features are basically content, things that you need to play the game. You have to learn it to play the game. 39 of the 92 features are things to support referencing while you're reading it and during gameplay, and when you come back to the game in the future to reactivate your long-term memory. And other things were styling, like art, and flavor text and things like that, that is important for motivation, and that you don't use too much of it to inhibit the other 2 areas, such as of content and referencing. So again, this is research that is post-dissertation here that needs to be more to be done with your help, to be done more in detail. And again, here I am, an experienced reader, and I made those 2 miscues. We played the game 4 times, and I was going, we have to be doing something wrong. And so even though the game is pleasurable, again, I go back to pleasurable to read, notice what I had in here that you have to keep in mind when you read a rule book like this, is that referencing is adequately supported, and that comprehensibility is confident where outside resources may be sought for confirmation. So I had to seek for confirmation. Was I playing this right? It's in the rule book, okay? But gamers will make miscues like I did. And in my opinion, if the reference was, the rule summary was more detailed, I would not have made those miscues. And again, I like the game, and I was thinking, gosh, we had to be doing something wrong, and I was right. But will other people who are not experienced hobbyists make those mistakes, who, again, this is in Target and Walmart, and who won't go to Board Game Geek to get the FAQ? Will they instead have a terrible experience and not play it and not want to buy the expansions and then give it a negative review? So we're almost done here. Trying to get to where I left off. Okay. So category 8 is emphasis. Did an awesome job of emphasis techniques. Now this is where you have biases as an evaluator. And again, this is why this is a baseline of the performance list. After evaluating more rule books and more people using it, there will be even more refined best practices. Let me explain what I'm talking about. In 8.1, organization and emphasis techniques provides quick referencing. It does do that. I would prefer, though, that we use bold and not capital letters. So let me explain. So it does use effective emphasis techniques. I mean, right here, importance in red. It has, the 3 layers. It has, boxing here. And the person who laid this out did an awesome job. But what I would prefer, as you will see right up here, is that instead of capitalizing keywords, that is in bolded. That is bold. So threat token should be bold in my opinion. End of turn effect bolded. And other things could be health tokens. That way, when I'm having the reference, I can find those keywords a lot quicker. So I almost dinged them for that. But then I had to take a step back and say, no, it is an emphasis technique. It is part of the recommendations in here. But is it best practice to use capital letters or instead to bold it? And again, we'd have to have that conversation as a community of practice to determine maybe that needs to be refined. And also with people reading rule books, will they give that feedback to us that they would prefer that over doing capital letters? So I had to take a step back as the evaluator and say, no, emphasis 8.1 was met. I'm just letting my bias almost seep in to deducting those points. And by the way, it would have been an 83% instead of an 85% if I would have taken off that category. All right, next one is format category, and I met all these. Again, whoever did the formatting on this rule book should be commended. If I need a rule book formatted, I would like to know who did the formatting on this rule book, because I may want to hire them someday. But 9.1 to 9.5 is all met there. And then when you get to the second part, 9.6 to 9.11. Now, you may notice it says here on 9.11, body text is 10-point font, but depending on the font, 10 points can have different sizes. So based on the research of, I think it was this book here in green, because this book goes into designing here for people who are visually impaired, that basically it talks about actual size in terms of, I think they used centimeters or millimeters, so I converted it, because I think the author is British, but I converted it to inches, and so 0.125 inches or larger, and it is that, because you got to understand, you're going to have people with, and again, having a white background, mostly white, is very appreciated. As I mentioned, I mean, I'm not looking forward to this. It's so dark. Anyway, good job on the layout. Okay, and then the visuals category, category 10. And so it did get dinged here in a couple areas. So rules can be understood without visuals. Now this is a very difficult category, feature to meet. It's in here because you might have rules for really small rule books for games that don't need visuals necessarily, such as chess would probably have it, but there's some abstract games that won't include in visuals, but it's also a way to make sure that people, when they write the rule book, that they don't over rely on the examples and other visuals. So that's why it's worth only 1 point, because it can be very difficult to meet, but it's there because you don't want to have the visuals as a crutch. And so I haven't found a rule book yet. I have to look at the first 8 if any one of them met that or not. I have to look that up. I think I'd have to look it up. But anyway, all visuals are labeled, and you'll see here, I'll get to that in a minute. And here's the other half of the visuals category. And again, it did a very good job in this area. And then you see here, all visuals are labeled. So if you notice on page 4 here and page 9, I have the context that is the location Times Square. But on page 9, it's talking about in turn effects. I would have liked to have had that reference. I don't need, I'm not going to remember on page 4 that tile is Times Square. It just takes a little text there, or to shrink down the image to show me which tile that is. Again, that's for me as a reader. What game piece is that? And then when you look at page 6, it talks about special effects. Well, I would like to have known that that's on the villain. What do they call these? Your dashboards? I'm trying to remember what it's called again. Yeah, villain dashboards. or that it's on, yeah. It doesn't really tell me that. It needed to include that, because usually you can get away with just having a little icon here and you talk about it, bam. But here, it needed to have some more context. So as you're reading the rules, you're looking at it and you're going, what is that? I'm not too sure what that is. And you just basically have to ignore it and move on. But it's in the back of your mind. I made a note about that. I said, what is that? I don't know what that necessarily is. So again, it can distract a reader. You don't want the reader using cognitive resources asking questions like that instead of focusing on comprehending the rules. Instead, they're spending time trying to figure out what it is. Okay, so in review, this is a well-written rule book. It's pleasurable to read. I enjoyed reading it. Now, I did have some questions. And again, I went over my miscues. I wish the referencing was better because, like I said, I made some miscues that made the game more difficult than necessary. And then, like I said, the FAQ came out, which cleared up some things that we did wrong too. With when we played, what's the name of that guy again? That's going to be the new Black Widow movie, Taskmaster. We played something wrong on that. So, as I mentioned before, you can get the PDF. This performance list will be available as a Creative Commons license after the Kickstarter. If you are interested in the research supplement, if you're a rulebook editor, writer, or game designer, I strongly recommend you look into getting that. The link is down below. And then if you want to look into more detailed research, especially how the 8 rule books were evaluated, the first 8, and additional research on what needs to be done with regard to referencing, for example. So this is just a little joke here. It's one of my favorite movies. That's my use of the evaluation, the performance list for this particular rule book. If someone wants to evaluate it, will you come up with a similar score? I doubt it will be that much different. It could be off by a little bit, and that's understandable. But if it is very different, then that's a conversation I need to have with the community as to why are there such different scores. Hopefully it won't be that far off if a different person uses the performance list. So thank you for watching this debut video on using the performance list. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be other opportunities. I will be doing future videos on using the performance list where you'll see me model other rule books. And thank you for watching.